Hey, welcome back again. We're talking about chapter 10 of the story. So trying to get people's first read through the Bible with the story. Great way to do it, abridged Bible. Someday go back and read all the details, but trying to get a high level view. And we're reading chapter 10 this week and we're reviewing on it. Obviously, I'm not in my office, no fancy green screen, just kind of at my house recording this one. We're on Thanksgiving break, so we didn't actually have a meeting this time in our small group, but I wanted to talk about the chapter. All these things, I start with like a verse of the day, just kind of for fun. This is not the verse of the day. This is preparation for it. You can pause the video if you want to and read the whole thing. But this is from Exodus, and this is when the Lord is talking to Moses on Mount Sinai. He talks about, out of all the nations, Israel will be my treasured possession, a kingdom of priests, and then the most important one, the last year, a holy nation. And so what does it mean to be holy? So something that is holy is set apart for God, right? And so the Israelites were called to be different, right? That's their fundamental, that's the purpose of this plan, right? And then we get to Samuel. So this is the verse of the day. The verse of the day is Samuel said that you got God as your king, right? So you don't need a king over you. You've got God as your king. And they said, no, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations. And it's like that's their credo, right? And so that's the verse of the day. And interestingly, when Samuel heard it, he talks to God about it, and God says, listen to him and give him a king, which is perfectly fitting for where we're at in the plan, which we'll talk about later. So that's the verse of the day. By the way, this call to be different is not just like a biblical thing. Like it's something that people use today. So I work at Rolls-Holman. You can see the shirt, college professor there. And in our faculty handbook, it talks about the unique character of Rolls-Holman. And so other people see a need to live intentionally, to have reasons behind what you do. And it's part of like our mission statement at Rose as well. By the way, it also says that as a faculty member, we're supposed to provide encouragement. So we're supposed to encourage our students to develop their moral character. Well, hopefully that's an important goal. And then it even says strengthening of religious faith. It doesn't say Christian because we're not a Christian school, but it recognizes the importance of like having intentionality in our mission statement. And so I thought that was really kind of neat. Like being different is something that we see as well. This chapter, as probably you read through it, so you're supposed to read the chapter, then come to these small groups. It might have felt like cut off, like at the end, it's like, whoa, it's an incomplete story. And the reason is that it's got a title, right? So standing tall, falling hard. I assume it's talking about Saul there. And if you read it thinking about like that this story is about Saul, you're probably going to be disappointed because they are trying, the authors, the committee of Zondervan that put this together, they're trying not to mention David yet, right? They're trying to like point towards David, but not talk about David. You can't actually tell the complete story of Saul without mentioning David. They overlap tremendously, right? And so that's why it does kind of feel a little like it got cut off. In fact, in this chapter, when they even kind of like reference David, they call him a man after God's own heart, right? And so they don't even say his name, right? So don't think of this as being about Saul. Think of it instead as being about Samuel. And then as soon as you shift your thinking to say, hey, this is about Samuel, then you've got a more complete story. You've got a more meaningful story here. So this is about Samuel. So who is Samuel? What's Samuel all about? I think the titles of the scrolls are funny. So after Judges, before Kings, there was the transition who was Samuel. So in a way, he was the last of the judges and the first of the prophets. He anoints both Saul and David. And so he's the man in the middle, which is the title of the scroll, right? Is Samuel. I just think it's kind of a funny way to look at it. As you start diving in to Samuel, read the story. Obviously, you should have done that before now. It gives you kind of like an abridged version of what's in the Bible. Watch the Bible Project video. Since the Bible Project video is going to be about like the whole scroll of Samuel, They do break it up into first and second, just because that's how the Old Testament breaks it up. We're not even doing all first thing. We're doing like the first half, like up through chapter 15. So watch up to like 5 minutes, like 4 minutes, 50 seconds. You can also watch Randy's study guide video, always very good, or the Maryland sermon. It really focuses on this call to be different. Their sermons are always very high level. I think it's always good to pause and think about where we're at in the big plan. I've been using Dan Kimball's for this most of the time, but I did want to try to start making my own, not necessarily because mine's any better than theirs, but just because like if you make it, it's more meaningful to you. So Randy, in his study guide, he breaks it up into like the 5 movements to help him think about it. Dan Kimball breaks it up into the 6 acts. So like we're right here where we're not quite to David in his acts. And what I was trying to do is I was trying to talk about the 7 steps. I just like 7 for literary effect, right? These are just learning tools, so I don't mind like massaging it to be 7 steps. And then for each step, there's a plan. So that's why I kind of call it God's 7 plans. Really, there's just one plan, right? To understand the plan, we have to know more about God, the character of God, his goals and motivation. And do be careful when you're looking at God's plan to never judge a plan, because this is God's plan. So kind of put yourself in proper perspective. But I do kind of break it up as to these steps and then some fancy title to implement the plan. So we are well past the spiritual things. We're well past the Eden plan. We're in the middle of the work with man plan. And you can kind of view it this way. So not worried about things that happened before the earth. Not really too worried about what happened in Eden. We're knee deep in the Bible and in the work with man plan is where we're at. And so the work with man plan, as kind of the previous slide said, this is God tried to do things the right way, the way he wanted with Eden, the ideal. That obviously didn't work. And so now he's working with people. Some people call it like a compromise or God's permissible plan. But he's definitely like involving people very directly at this kind of like phase in God's plan. If you click into these links, you can see that there's phases of each plan. So starting with just an idea with Abraham, the plan is furthered by using sin. So there's a lot of sin that happens, that the people that reject God and cracks in the family and leading to selling Joseph to Egypt. But it does continue God's plan one way or another. So God's plan is going to move forwards. You just get to decide if you're part of it or not. The body of Israel gets bigger, fruitful, and multiply during a time of slavery. So they're involved in the growing of their own body, which is neat. The nation is born, the Exodus. Admittedly, the people do very little and God does a lot. The birth of the body, right? The born-again covenant at Sinai gives them the 10 commandments, which are kind of like, hey, these are the things that I can't be flexible on. And then the rest of the law, which is largely a permissible compromise to help point them in the right direction, which ultimately points them to Jesus to fulfill the law. But that's kind of like where they're at. The wilderness time, the 40 years in the wilderness, it's kind of like their adolescent phase. Wrongdoings are punished, like shorter cycle on them, right? So we're training. People are really killed during this time. But that's kind of where it falls into the big picture. Didn't want to be too like light about it. Their conquest, they're effectively forming their own Eden, right? So like in the first plan, God just gives them Eden, gives them bodies. Like, here you go. Like that's where they start. But here they're involved in the creation of Eden. So Eden is a place where heaven and earth come together, where God dwells and delights. That's what God sees the promised land as. Like you're standing on sacred ground. They are called to create it with God, not just given to them. They're called to drive out the Canaanites and their gods. And God, one man routs 1,000, right? It's kind of the time there. They are not fully successful the way that God wanted, because it's a combination of God and man, right? Which is what you expect. And then after that, they're kind of all grown up, right? That's their rite of passage, equivalent to like college today. And they enter the time of Judges. God empowers people through the Holy Spirit. He doesn't necessarily endorse every action they have to continue his plan is kind of how I see Judges. So they talk about 12 judges. And then now we're transitioning into the time of kings. And Samuel chapter 10 here is the transition point, the final judge and the first prophet. That's who Samuel is. So that's kind of what's going on there. See if I can actually successfully get back to the slides now. And so God's permissible plan, not a complete picture of God, but definitely learning about the character of God in these stories. So lots of stories in this chapter. I kind of break it up to sort of there's Hannah's vow, the lost ark and God's return. There's a little bit, not much in the story about the time of Samuel, like his adult career life, his time as a judge, his battle at Mishpah. I'll talk about it some, but it wasn't really in the story much. The story does talk about the initial meeting with Saul, the coronation of Saul, and then his victories and also his downfall, right? One of the take-home messages in this chapter is be confident enough in God to wait for his timing. And so I think that's kind of like the big picture of asking for a king. And you see this in some in Saul's actions of not waiting for Samuel, but that's one of the big pictures. Dates, I always enjoy kind of thinking about locations and dates. It's not in the Bible, which means it's not required to understand the God-breathed message, but I enjoy it because it helps cement the ideas in my head is really what it does. The first thing I want to point out is there's a lot of overlap here. So you kind of assume that you read Judges and it comes to an end, and then you start reading Samuel and it begins. The Old Testament even slips in the book of Ruth, right? But really they're back to back. But they're not just back to back. They're overlapping, right? In fact, Samuel was born probably before Samson, right? So they're overlapped that much. And they're born. There's a lot of similarities about their birth, which we'll talk to. And Samuel is, he goes around judging for Israel. So he's a judge. He's not one of the 12 judges from Judges, but he's a judge. So he's the last judge, really, not Samson. And it's interesting that because of their overlap, he could have met Samson, probably didn't, right? They're in different north-south regions. Could have met Ruth. He goes to visit Jesse, and Jesse's dad was Obed, and Obed's mom was Ruth, right? So could have actually run into Ruth, and so there is overlap in this time period, which is just kind of interesting. There's lots of ways to kind of visualize the timelines. There's a couple that I found online I thought I'd share with you. This is one website. This is talking about the book of Judges, and tries to figure out the timeline for Judges. And you can see that different people interpret things differently. So this one tries to really make no overlap. So it's like, hey, here was Samson, and then that same year is when they lost the ark, and then that's when Samuel took over, and then Saul was appointed by Samuel. This one, though, it shows a really weirdly short time for Saul. So it's like, I don't know, we're just guessing when it comes to years. I think this next slide shows it a little better. Same website, but they kind of show somebody else's theory. But it shows all of Judges. You could pause and look at the slide for half an hour. But the thing that I like about it is that it shows the overlap of Samuel and Samson really clearly, right? They coexisted is what's going on. They both have conflicts with the Philistines. Samuel more in the north, Samson more in the south. But that kind of shows the overlapping timeline of the information that we're getting here, right? Authorship, I always put this slide in here just because I like to talk about it, but the authorship is many people, right? Then obviously it was written by people who were close to Saul, who were close to David. And so this scroll, we think of books having one author. That's not how it worked, right? And so it was controlled by scribes who just poured themselves into this for years, right? Making it better. Maybe Samuel started it. That's perfectly reasonable. He obviously shared some information in this. He was a main character. We see his birth. Really, the scroll is just named after Samuel. That's why it's called Samuel. Not because he wrote it. It's just named after him because he's the first character. He anoints both Saul and David, who are the two main characters. So the book could have been called The First Two Kings or Saul and David. But it's called Samuel because it's named after him. And also say that starting now, we start getting a lot more details. Like if you compare the details of Samuel versus the details of Judges, like Judges is like 375 years, like all smushed into a chapter with 12 different people. Samuel is just 2 people. And I would say that David is more important than Judges in general, but Saul's really not, right? And so Saul, like who's more important, Othniel or Saul, right? Othniel got 3 verses, maybe 4. Saul gets like a whole bunch of a chapter, and we're starting to get a lot more details, which details are good. You can see important things in details, but do know that like we went from a macroscopic view to a microscopic view, and it's because of the scribes, right? And so delighted to get all this information, delighted that God chose to put this into the Bible, but it definitely is like important to know that we've changed. Like the Bible shifts a lot in how they say things, but we've changed a lot. We're still historical, but in our detail level, right? Characters, obviously Samuel, obviously Saul. We see just like a glimmer of David in this chapter. Comically, this picture, that's David's hand right there. And then we hear a lot about the Philistines, or Philistia, which was this region where Israel is largely the hill country, and then Philistia was the sea people who controlled the coast. Lots of other people in this. Sorry, I'm sure my bubble's over some of these. But we've got Eli, his 2 worthless sons, Hophni and Phinehas. It calls them worthless in the Bible. I didn't just insult them. Elkanah and his 2 wives. 2 wives. People, 2 wives. Come on, you're killing me with this 2 wives thing. Read Genesis 2. They had different Bibles. They didn't call it Genesis 2, of course. Samuel and his 2 sons who did not follow his father's ways, Joel and Abijah. We have Saul's son Jonathan is in this, and there's a lot with Jonathan and David, but we're not talking about David yet. We even get details in the Bible, not the story, about like the commander of Saul's forces, who's Abner. And there's actually a lot in the Bible about Abner, because we're going like way into details. Like we know who like David's commander was, Joab, and we know who Joab's brothers were, like Ashiel, and I forget the other one's name. But we get in some details now, right? We get details about who they're fighting against. The first person Saul fought was Nahash of the Ammonites. I always get Ammonites and Amorites confused, but he was from the Ammonites. Details about his treaty to let you surrender us if I get to gouge out everybody's right eye, right? So showed a picture of a right eye. Details about Agag. Agag is kind of like a generic name for king of the Amalekites. And how they were supposed to be totally destroyed like Joshua, but they weren't. All kinds of characters in here. Locations. I can talk about locations for hours and hours. I thought I'd put this slide up because it shows some of the towns. Interestingly, this slide is from a website that's talking about the Judges 19 through 21 story. And you could read that story, and you could read how all these towns were in that story. Not a good story. It's like it's the final story in a book about moral corruption, right? Not a good story. But in that story, it talks about these places, and these are also mentioned in Samuel. So I thought I'd just do the Samuel. So Ramah, this is where Samuel's parents were. They would go up to Shiloh for the annual feast. Whenever Samuel fought against the Philistines, it was at Mizpah, and just crazy. And then he anoints Saul, who's a man from Gibeah. And the first thing he does is he sends Saul to Rachel's tomb in Bethlehem. And then once Saul is king and he's plowing his field, they say, hey, the men of Jabesh Gilead are under attack from the Ammonites, from Nahash, right? And so, like, all these towns from this story are mentioned, like, again here, and these connections are, like, crazy. So, like, Jabesh Gilead, in this story, they stole the wives from there to give to the Benjamites. You'll have to read it. But here they need help, so it's kind of like their role is a little reversed. And so it's really interesting to see these connections and to spend time meditating on this literature and seeing how it all fits together. It's so cool. I just think it's neat that I could take a picture from some other story and it shows the locations in this story, which is crazy. Other cities. So when Samuel was a judge, he kind of made a circuit judging for people, so you knew where to find him. This is kind of the route that he took. His parents and their annual trip to Shiloh, so they weaned in Ramah, grew up in Shiloh for Samuel, so all about Samuel. Locations for the Philistines. Where did they come from? Who were they? So they were a sea people. So the sea people, like generically, there's a lot of sea people. One of the groups is the Philistines. They went all over, right? So like from Crete, from Cyprus, lots of pottery from Crete and Cyprus found in this area. Lots of historical records that they fought the Canaanites, the Philistines. They fought the Egyptians. They actually caused like one of the major like interstitial falling times of the Egyptians, which is interesting because the sea people made the kingdom of Israel possible, right? So they brought down the Egyptians and then they killed a bunch of Canaanites. And so the Philistines, who are the enemies in these stories of the Israelites, actually were the group that made the kingdom of Israel possible, right? Like if you just look at history and not think about God, right? It's just kind of interesting. Their 5 biggest cities, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, Gath, Ekron, and then their different oppressions of pushing into the hills, right? So they controlled the plains, they controlled the road, they had all the good parts, right, already, but they're pushing into the hills and the hill people, the nation of Israel, Judah. You can see that there's all these separations that start happening already about Israel and Judah, and they're pushing through at Apex, and they're fighting with Samson down low. Really interesting bits of history here. Again, maps aren't in the Bible. God-breathed information. Must not need to know locations, but I find it really fun to look at. Locations we're going to see in the Ark story. The Aphek area is like where they mounted. Shiloh is where the Ark was. They're worried about the Ark, so they arm people in Ebenezer, but then they actually send the Ark out into battle, and then it travels until God brings it back. We'll talk about that one. I also like to use different books, so I use these books so all the time. They're always open on my desk, right? So this is the older one. This picture came from there. This is the newer one, the Zondervan updated edition. I've always got these books floating around on my desk. So many good resources when you've got the internet and books like this at your disposal. They show a lot of the same places for a lot of the same cities. The path that the Ark took to end up at Kiriam Jirith, and so this is where the oxen wandered to. Actually, they may have wandered to Beth Shem, but then they got the Ark this far, where it stayed for quite a while. All the different people that Saul fight against: the Ammonites, the Amalekites, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Zoabites, it says Zoab in the Bible, and the different places that he fought against. And he also fought against the Philistines, Philistia, and he pushed the nation of Israel to become larger in the east, in the south, in the southeast, but really he had conflicts with Philistia, but he never successfully got out of the hills, right? Like he never got control of the road. He couldn't do it, right? Jonathan had some successes against him. One of the big problems is God didn't like fully support. God supported Saul, but God wasn't. God didn't choose Saul to have victories here. And they were also fighting Philistia without any blacksmiths. I don't know if you read that part in the Bible, but there were no blacksmiths in Israel. They had to go to Philistia to get a plow sharpened, right? Like, I don't know how you fight a fight with it's like, hey, we're going to storm Normandy, but without guns. Like we don't have any bullets, but we're going to storm Normandy with bayonets, right? And so, not at a point where they can, through human power, have any like ability to defeat Philistia. So somebody still has to deal with this Philistia issue, right? Which we'll get to, but not yet. So interesting. What we do get in chapter 10 here is we're setting the stage for a lot of things. We get a lot of important stories, especially when you start like diving in. So This picture is one that my head was over before. Elkanah, this is Samuel's dad. His 2 wives would go up to Shiloh, to the tabernacle. By the way, the picture here shows it as like a building, but it actually may have still looked like a tent, right? Personally, I think it probably did still look like a tent. I bet it was the same tent from 400 years ago. Not perfect, perhaps, but this artist obviously kind of redrew it as like a tent building. Maybe they're right. Maybe, who knows? But we can look at the details here. We can see what happens when you have 2 wives. It doesn't go well. One has children, the other doesn't. They are in constant conflict. Remind you of Leah and Rebecca. Remind you of Hagar and Sarah. The Bible, my son said this the other day, it's like, the Bible's like a study guide, right? It's like, yes, this is very good. And then he goes on to say, it's like, it teaches us all the things that we need to live our lives. And I was like, well, that's optimistic, right? It teaches us examples of how we should view things so that we can figure out how to live our lives, right? But so what are we learning about from God and Hannah here? So Hannah makes a vow that she's barren. She knows she's not going to have children. It's a done deal, right? Year after year, she knows that's not going to happen. She makes an authentic, very passionate, very focused on God's plan vow that if she were to have children, that it would have to come from God, right? And so she, the tricky part here is, like, does she bargain with God that she's going to give the first son? Elkanah is worried about it. He's like, I hope that God keeps up his side of your deal. But she does, in fact, have Samuel. She does, in fact, give him to Eli to serve in the temple for his whole life. And it does, in fact, go very, very, very well, right? Which is interesting. A lot of similarities to how she gave up Samuel, to how Abraham gave up Isaac. Obviously, Isaac was going to be sacrificed, and then God said, don't do that. But there's a lot of similarities and links in the Bible. And then, of course, this is similar to God giving up his own son, right? And so just lots of interesting things here. Her vow is interesting to look at in detail. You can kind of see some of the details here. And it is kind of important to reflect on, is it important to bargain with God? Like, hey, God, if you do this, I'll do this, right? Like, the message is a little confusing here. I'll say that we see other places about bargaining isn't part of praying, right? God gives you things out of his grace, not because of what we do. We don't get into heaven because of the works that we've done. Look here on the sheet of paper, the works I've done. It comes from grace, right? And so it's important to kind of distinguish that a little bit, because you could see a little bit of confusion here in Hannah's vow. After her vow, after she has Samuel, after she gives Samuel to God, and she has 7 more children after that, 3 of which I think were sons, and she has a prayer which is recorded in the Bible. And so this is the nice thing about, hey, if your son goes on to write a bunch of Bible, then your prayers make it into the Bible as well. But her prayer is very interesting to look at. She has a clear idea of who God is and who she is, and in respect to that, and like her words point to Jesus in so many ways. And so, like, those who are hungry, hunger no more. You bring death and make alive. You bring down to the grave and you raise up, right? Like, all these words pointing to Jesus well before, 1,000 years before, right? Raises the poor, inherits the throne. And it's not by our strength that no one prevails. She also says, like more pathetic short-term things. The Most High will thunder from heaven. This actually happens in Samuel's life at least twice, maybe even a third time. I'll have to go look. And so it's like these things happen, right? So it's like you see the significance of her prayer here. Whenever you look at prayer, by the way, sometimes it's good to pause for a minute. Just pause, Samuel. Let's look at the Lord's Prayer, just kind of for a minute. So the Lord's Prayer is an example that Jesus gives to his disciples about how to pray. Things that you see in it, just kind of like pick out a couple. It's simple. It's not elaborate prayer. It doesn't go on for an hour. So simple. It's authentic. And it acknowledges who God is, God the Father. It acknowledges who we are and how we fit in to the picture. So there's an ask there. So give us today our daily bread. There's an acceptance of God's will. Your kingdom come. Your kingdom is going to come, right? Like you are going to make a new heaven and new earth. It's going to happen, right? And the first thing is your will be done. And Jesus says this, like, not my will, but yours be done, like as he's facing his death. With my kids, by the way, sometimes like when they're saying, I sneak in the words, in my life too, just for fun. Your will be done in my life too. Not my will, but your will be done, right? And it talks about how we need to be redeemed. Some translations use sins here. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Some say, forgive us our transgressions. Sins, debts, transgressions. You can see why they're all used in translations. They're all similar. Like so there's a cleansing that needs to happen. And so deliver us from evil is kind of the Lord's Prayer here. So you could spend a lot of time looking at these words and thinking about them and looking at translations. But I just kind of wanted to reflect on it. So like Hannah's kind of big prayer, Jesus' kind of simple model of prayer. Moving on. All right, so moving on. Let's talk about this ark stolen, captured thing. What's going on here? So if you read the details, this is actually prophesied to Samuel. So God says to Samuel, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears it tingle. All right. He's talking about the ark going away and then coming back here. And they, what they do is they're worried about the Philistines who are assembling and mobilizing and coming into Aphek. And Aphek is a direct shot to Silo, right? So the Israelites form up in this area. Maybe it's actually Silo farther back. But they have a fight in this spot. They lose the first day. And so the second day they say, hey, let's bring the ark down, right? And so God will win this for us. And they do it on their terms, with their timing. And it's interesting that like with Jericho, God said, hey, bring the ark into the fight, walk around with it. Like, don't you fight, bring the ark. When they cross the Jordan, he says, bring the ark, right? And so they do what the same actions that somebody else did, but not consulting God about it, just doing it, right? And they lose bigger time. They lose the ark. Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli, are both killed. They go report the news to Eli. Eli falls over dead. So it went bad. And I think the take-home message, different people look at things differently. This is the words of David Baines from our church. And so he kind of asked the questions differently, perhaps better than I do it. But I think the big thing that he said that I really liked is they were being presumptuous. They were trying to manipulate God into serving their ends. So it's like, you go kill them all, right? And they weren't following God's will. They were trying to manipulate God for their ends. Yeah, it doesn't go well. And when Hophni and Phinehas, two worthless men, are at the helm, it's probably not going to honor God. And it's interesting to see that like this follows with the second command of like not making idols and worshiping them. Like numerous times in history, people bring like almost religious good luck charms, like crosses get used this way a lot. And we've got to be careful about that, right? So we've got to be obedient to follow God's wills, not use good luck charms to our advantage. There is definitely something significant about the ark. It does end up in Philistine control, and it does end up coming back. And so God makes the statue of Dagon fall down in the temple multiple times, doesn't want to be in the same room with Dagon. Brings out plagues on the people. They send it from Ashdod to Gath. Same thing happens in Gath. They send it to Ekron. From Ekron, they do a funny thing. They put it on a cart. They don't guide it. They just put it on a cart. They put 2 oxen there, and they walk and watch it from the hill. And if it goes to Israel, then God wanted it back. It does, right? It goes to Israel. And it ends up at Kiriath Jearim. And the Ark story is not over. So it's interesting to see the Ark story. The saddest thing in that whole story is that the poor oxen who carried it back, they were sacrificed as soon as they brought it back. It's like, I felt bad for the oxen. Take home message here. The Israelites aren't even involved in this coming back story. God is involved. And really what you see is that God's will is going to get done, right? And you can choose to be a part of it, but God's will is going to get done one way or another. Other things that we can learn, this one's a trickier one. This prophecy to Samuel when he was only a boy says that at that time I will carry against Eli everything I spoke against him. So this is like the next chapter of what we just read, from beginning to end, because I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons blasphemed God, and he failed to restrain them, right? And so everything I swore against Eli will be done. If you want to see what God said to Eli, that's in Samuel chapter 2, so one chapter before. And he, not too surprising, says, I called you to minister before me, but you've disdained me, and I will cut short your strength. And then the thing that I find confusing is that he says, no one from your family line will ever reach old age. It's kind of weird. It's kind of like punishing people that aren't even born yet. And, he says that Hophni and Phinehas will die on the same day, which they do, right? On the day the ark is captured, the day the people's ears tingled. But then it goes on and it says your whole family line will need to beg for food so that they can be free just to get food to eat. And none of them will reach old age. Why is this multiple punishment thing happen? And actually, it reminds us of things we've read before, right? So Deuteronomy says, I am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the parent. So punishing the children for the sins of the parent to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. And so I'm not smart, but I see this and I see that I don't understand it. And somehow you've got to get into this mindset. When you see something you don't understand, you should be happy because when you don't understand it, God said it, God did it, God is good, it's true. So what needs to change is me, right? And so I need to change my understanding of really what's going on here. How do you do that? Just wanted to talk a little bit about practical approaches to leaning into something. So one way is to read it in English and pretend like it's all about you. So it's if I sin, my sons are going to suffer. It's well, that's not really the best way to learn. You could lean into it more by learning Hebrew. You could learn to read Hebrew. You could learn what the different words mean. You could learn Greek to kind of get the New Testament. That's hard. What we can do, though, is we can look at different translations. So, for example, this is just a tool, Bible Gateway. This is my main Bible, right? They have a tool where you can actually look at a verse through many different translations. There's 40 different translations of this Deuteronomy 9. Usually I quote NIV. So this is the one I quoted. I'm a jealous God, punishing children for the sins of their parents to the third and fourth generation. The most interesting part of this, I think, is this last part. Of those who hate me. And so the question is, who does this describe? Does this describe the parents? And the children may love God and get punished. Or does it describe the children? Because it's definitely true that when a parent sins, rejects God, hates God, they set up a situation that affects the children, right? That part is just true. And then the question is that last part. So different translations say it in a different way. This one kind of says that the generations reject me, right? And then some of the others say it even differently. I don't know which one's which like of us. This one says it kind of interesting. To whoever hates me, even down to the great-grandchildren, whoever hates me. So it's interesting that different people have interpreted differently. So definitely think about it. The other thing you can do is you can go look at commentaries. So for example, there's tons of people that have commentaries about the Bible. Tom Constable is one that I've liked. They show his on NetBible. If you ever read NetBible, this link would go to NetBible. And he kind of talks about this jealous God as God is jealous when we commit to loving something other than God, right? So if we love money, that makes God feel jealous, right? Because he really desperately wants us to choose to love him. And so that's how the word jealous does, in fact, describe God, which is kind of a different connotation of jealous than I had in my head first. And he does, in fact, have times in the Bible where he disciplines people who hate and reject him. To be honest, I see more times where people earthly get away with it for quite some time, right? And apostasy, so like something that's against God, does affect generations. And it often produces several generations of descendants who hate God. They still have their own choice, but children do often tend to follow their parents. The other thing, the important take-home message, I should have grabbed this, is that his blessings extend 1,000-fold, and his punishments are listed as third and fourth generations, and so that's kind of important. Just to talk more about commentaries, by the way, this Tom Constable that I like, you could listen to him read the Bible with his audio lessons for almost the whole Bible. In fact, you could go listen to him read Samuel, and then you get his commentary right in there. So it's really a good way to lean into things that you don't understand. And I think I'm starting to understand this punishing the children for the sins of the parents thing better. So that's just kind of all I'll say about that. Next story. So that was kind of all about Hannah's vow and the birth of Samuel. Samuel is not a little kid forever. You get this cool visual, by the way, of Hannah bringing him a robe every year as he's growing up. So cute. He becomes a man, right? He becomes the high priest. He becomes the last judge. He judges people, right? He becomes the first prophet. He anoints Saul. He anoints David. Big important guy, right? One of the things he does in his time as an adult is the Philistines were drawing near to engage Israel in battle at Mizpah, which is the same as that Judges story. Samuel doesn't run away. He doesn't flee to Moab, right? He's standing right in the middle of it. And the Philistines are like pressing down on him. And Samuel is very passionately offering sacrifices and praying to God. And what we see God answer with thunder, is what it says, that threw them into a panic. I don't know what this thunder was like. It must have been some kind of thunder. I grabbed a picture that shows lightning. Lightning and thunder aren't necessarily connected, but lightning is the visual thing you see, and thunder is the sound. It says thunder in the Bible. And as a result, they subdue the Philistines. It says take back Ekron and Gath, 2 of the 5 big cities. They hold the Philistines at bay, right? It's really all the best that we can hope for right now. And the question is, well, what did Samuel do right? So he was a leader all the days of his life, even after he appointed Samuel as king. And what did he do right? And I'd say the big thing that he did right is he turned to the Lord, right? He didn't grab an ark and drive it out there. He didn't. What did Samuel do that was terrible, right? He didn't pray for revenge and strength. And so he knew who God was. He knew his place, and he knew his need for God. And God does answer Samuel's prayers here, right? So it's really interesting. Next story, enter Saul. So Samuel tried to appoint his sons, Joel and Abijah, as the next judges in Beersheba, I think it was. They didn't walk in his ways. People didn't want to have anything to do with it. The people wanted a king. The people wanted to be like all the other nations, right? Was it bad for the people to want a king? Was that surprising? And I'll say that it was not surprising. In fact, to Abraham, God promised that kings will come from you. So God was planning for the Israelites to have kings come from the line of Abraham, right? So God had always planned David, I think is really what it is, to be the king. And 30 years before God's timing, the people demand a king now, right? So it's not that they were doing something that was completely out of left field. It's that their timing wasn't God's timing. And if we look at Abraham, we mentioned Abraham here in this quote. Let's look at Abraham and the promises to him. Like, you will have many descendants, right? And Abraham is worried that it's not happening. And so with Hagar, he has Ishmael, and it doesn't go well, right? And so this waiting for God's timing is important. And Saul makes the same mistake in his reign, his short, unexciting reign, right? And that is, in fact, one of the take-home messages here, is that the people are saying that they want a king. They're not following God's timing, and it's not against Samuel. It's a rejection of God, which is what they've been doing for a long time, and they're doing it to Samuel. Samuel took it personally, right? But God said, "Hey, it's not about you. It's about me," right? So they're rejecting me, and so they want a king such as all the other nations. So interestingly, if we look at this choice, God does tell Samuel to give him a king, and God is not opposed to Samuel. You would think that God would be opposed to or not Samuel, but Saul. God, in fact, blesses him. God changes his heart through the Holy Spirit to become a new man. God helps give him confidence by letting him prophesy when he heads to Rachel's tomb. And they say, is Saul one of the prophets now? And he's coronated. He's actually humble in his coronation. Lots of good things, right? And so it's really interesting that God supports man's plan, even though it wasn't his timing. And God goes all in to make him a success. And God says, hey, let's do it your way, right? Is what God said. And God gives every opportunity. And then people talk about Saul, and they say how Saul had some good times, but then he finished bad. I would say he didn't necessarily even start that well, right? So the first thing that Saul does, so Saul is anointed king. He's king now. Woo! He's like, we don't even know what kings do, right? So Saul, he was obviously plowed the field with oxen, right? The field needed plowing. So he goes back to Gibeah and he's plowing the field with his ox. It's kind of funny to think of a king as plowing his field with his ox. But the people come to him because he is the king, while he's plowing the field with his ox, and say, hey, Nahash, the Ammonite, he's attacked Gilead. He's given them a week. And he says that they can surrender. I don't know why he gives them a week. So long as he gouges out the right eye of everybody, not much of an offer. And they got a week before something needs to happen, right? And so they come to Saul. And so Saul's first moment, this is when you pray, right? This is when you listen to God, you pray for God's help. You still act, you do your parts. Saul cuts up the oxen in anger. He cuts them to pieces, has strength from God to cut up these oxen, sends them 12 pieces throughout Israel to gather the troops, and says, hey, if you don't follow the Lord, or if you don't follow my command, then this is going to happen to you too, right? And so they assemble at Besek, and it does work, right? The people come, it says 300,000 come, and it does work, but it works in the same way that the story from Judges worked. So they cut up a woman and sent her 12 pieces. So a man from Gibeah cut up a woman to 12 pieces, and it does get the people to come, right? It succeeds in getting people to come. But I don't think that was what God wanted Saul to do, right? So he didn't start good. In human terms, he was successful in a victory, right? It was a big win. But in God's eyes, I think he started pretty bad, right? So echoing that story is not the way to start your kingship. It's also interesting to wonder if Samuel wrote that Judges 19 through 21 story before or after this, right? It's possible that he had written it a long time ago and then it happened. That's very possible. Or it's also possible that he saw this thing from Saul and he's like, there's a story that's totally about this that needs to be in the Bible, right? I don't know, it's just interesting to wonder about. Hard to say for sure. Definitely God breathed, definitely in the Bible, so we could see these things and these connections. Saul then has one good moment. So after he wins these battles, they gain new territory. He rescues Jabesh Gilead. The people say, it's like, who was it that said that Saul shouldn't be king? Let's kill them all, right? And Saul steps in and says, nobody should be put to death today, for this is the day that the Lord has rescued Israel. And this giving credit to the Lord, this is Saul's shining moment. If his whole kingship had been like this, we would have a very different, very, very different story here. It doesn't stay like this, right? They renew the kingship at Gilgal. We get a miraculous sign of thunder. Saul has asked God to show the truth of these things, and thunder and rain during the wheat harvest, which shouldn't have happened. And Samuel really takes the role of prophet here, and he gives warnings, right? So if you persist in doing evil, you and your king will both perish. And so Saul is getting a warning again here. God's patient with him. Wasn't so excited about the oxen thing. Made some good and bad choices. Let's see how it goes now. So time passes. More problems come up. He's battling Israel from all sides. The next one is more pressure from the Philistines. And Saul starts assembling people in Gilgal. That's the camp that Joshua started in right by Jericho. And they're assembling people, and they've got a plan where they're going to wait like 7 days or whatever, and Samuel's going to come and offer the offerings, and then we're going to be off. And Saul sees a problem. Saul sees people are deserting. People aren't uniting. We're losing some people, and it's time to go. And Samuel's not here. I don't know why Samuel's not here. He's not there because God's slowing him down, right? And he sees the problem. He takes matters into his own hands, and he solves them his way on his terms with his timing, right? And so Saul offers the offering. And then, half an hour later, I don't know how much later, sometime later, Samuel shows up and is like, whoa, what did you do? You were told to wait here for me. And it's minor. It's like, oh, hey, this is not a big deal. This is just like, I did the offering instead of you. No big deal, right? I saw people were leaving, so I did it. It is a big deal. It's rejection of God's will. It's disobedience. And we see Saul's choice, right? He then goes and fights the Philistines with no blacksmiths. Jonathan has some success, but they eventually just kind of at best break even with the Philistines. From there's more problems with Agag and the Amalekites. So let's kind of leave the Philistines for now. Let's go south, right? And gets a command from God, more opportunities. Gets a command from God very similar to clearing the Promised Land, to attack the Amalekites, totally destroy them. Don't spare them. Men and women, children and infants. Always hard to hear God say these words, but this is a God-commanded clearing of land. God knows a lot more than we do. There's reasons behind it. We don't see it here. He says, destroy the sheep and the cattle, the camels, the donkeys. You see the command very clear, and this is what Saul does. And so they go and they fight, and they're victorious. It works for them. They capture Agag. They don't kill him. They capture him. They capture the best sheep and the best cattle, and they don't destroy them. They keep them, right? They only destroy things that are weak, things that are despised. It's the choice that Saul made, and it's a very human choice. It's like, hey, these are some good sheep. We could use these sheep. My dad could use these sheep. And they don't destroy them. They're confronted by Samuel and said, hey, why did you choose your way? And Saul lies about it, right? So it's like, oh, I intended to offer them as animal sacrifices to God. It's like, yeah, right. Samuel even says, enough, right? That's kind of his phrase here. Those of us that have kids, we've hit this moment before. And by the way, we also see the Amalekites come right back in chapter 27. So this complete destruction, where they didn't kill Agag, they didn't kill the sheep, the cattle, is not quite as complete as what we said. And by the way, Samuel is the one who does kill Agag, cuts him to pieces, I think is the phrase, not Saul. So An interesting start of the kingship. Definitely has victories. One historian claimed that it might have doubled the population. Hopefully they got some blacksmiths out of it. But definitely to the east, to the southeast, to the south. And their battles with Philistia are keeping them at bay at best. Somebody's going to have to come in and have a confrontation with Philistia. So we definitely see examples of breaking God's timing. We definitely see examples of God's grace. Did Saul deserve these victories? No way, Jose. Did Saul deserve so many chances? Multiple chances. Multiple signs from God. He's forfeited his right. God's plan is still going to move forwards, but it's not going to be with Saul. It's time to find a successor, right? And I always wondered, did people even see this dramatic fall that was happening, or did they only see the victories, right? And the answer is probably a lot. Only saw the victories. Just to kind of talk about things in my life as well. So I always kind of like to kind of make stories from the Bible, see how they're personal as well. So the story that I thought of was from when I was like 14. I think I say 13. The slide's here. So when I was younger, I went to church. I had a Bible quizzing program I really got into. I really liked it. I was closer with God. I had ups and downs through my life, which I'm embarrassed about. 43 now. But when I was like 14 or so, I was sitting in church, had a sheet of paper in my lap sitting on a hymn book, know which pew I was in, know what the church looks like. I had this idea, I daydream a lot, that wouldn't it be cool to like do what the pastor does, like to be up front and like talk. So never would have been afraid of public speaking, actually like jealous of like being a pastor. And it's like, oh, wouldn't it be fun if like people said, it's like, oh, where did this 14-year-old get this knowledge, right? Like, reading about how they say about Jesus and he was 12 and in the synagogues, right? It's like, wouldn't that be cool? And so, not maybe about as intelligent as Samuel, not really understanding when I'm being spoken to or when I'm getting my ideas, where they come from. I am daydreaming, sitting there in church, not listening to the pastor at all, I'm sure, wondering what would my message be. And I kind of get the idea, pops in my head, that what I should talk about is pride. So that was like the message that was on my heart to talk about. And I was like, oh yeah, I can run with this, right? And I don't see pride correctly when I'm 14. I see pride as a good thing. I don't know the Bible very well, right? I think about, I grew up in Indiana. I grew up like Notre Dame football, like, I don't know, like these feelings of pride. Hoosiers is where I grew up. Pride being like the goal. And I had this sheet of paper on my hymnal, and I thought about the sheet of paper, and I thought about, it's like, oh, that's what it is. It's like, if you were to take a sheet of paper and you were to write down the things that you did in your life, is that list something you would be proud of, right? Is it something that you would show to God and say, that's me, right? And that was the message that I was formulating in my head that I wanted to deliver. For sadly, probably like months, I was thinking about how important this pride was. And then I started to be like, hey, I should look up some Bible verses. I should look up, Bible verses to support what I'm saying, right? And the first one I found didn't really support it. So I found another one that didn't really support it either. And then after a while, I realized that pride is one of the 7 deadly sins. And it's like, really? Yeah, I realized only later in life that it probably was God speaking to me, and probably did give me the message of pride, but not to preach in front of a church. He gave it to me to learn, right? And it's something I've struggled with my whole life. And so like the timing of like sharing with others wasn't when I was 14, right? Like hopefully now I'm at least able to help some people and share some things. But if I had tried to push my timing through then, it was going to be a bad mistake, right? Also, I will say, just kind of give some credit to pride. So there is a difference between the type of pride that God hates, so trying to do a better job talking about pride, versus the type of pride that we can feel in a job well done. This is a quote from this link. This is not me. or the kind of pride we feel over the accomplishment of a loved one, right? There can be types of pride that are different. The type of pride that God hates is this self-righteous conceit. So like when you look and you want things for you, like I wanted to be the person in front of the church, right? I didn't want it to be the pastor who did it and gave a good message. I wanted it to be me, right? And so that was the type of pride that I needed to learn that God hated, and it was a hindrance to seeking Him. And so that was a important message for me. By the way, I also really like the verse. I've mentioned this before, but to ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into the harvest field, right? And so it doesn't have to be you that's doing it. You should pray that the work of the Lord, that God's will gets done. Thy will be done, right? And it doesn't have to be you. And so pride is saying that you just want to see God's will get done. And don't be surprised if He calls you if you pray that prayer. But that's kind of something there. So, all right, a little something for my life there. So this chapter 10, which kind of feels like a short, like incomplete message, has lots of really great stories in it. It's the story of Samuel. It's the story of transition from judges to kings. And we see some of the failures of Saul's early reign, even though God did everything to make man's plan be a success. And we managed to do it without even saying the word David. But we're going to see David a lot next time. All right. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you for chapter 11. Bye.